She had been invisible for 3 years. Nobody remembered her name during rounds. Nobody asked her opinion in trauma bays. Nobody noticed the way her hands never shook. Not during cardiac arrests, not during bleeds, not during the kind of emergencies that made grown physicians press themselves flat against the wall and go pale. For 3 years, Megan Callahan had kept her head down, her mouth shut, and her past buried so deep she almost believed it herself. Then a military working dog came through the emergency room doors at a dead sprint, and everything she had spent 3 years hiding walked straight back into the light. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside by people who never bothered to see what you were actually capable of, this story is going to hit differently. Stay with us until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming next, and drop a like while you're here. We genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments. It means more than you know, and it helps us see just how far these stories are traveling. Now, let's go back to where it started. Red Creek, Montana, didn't look like a place where anything important happened. It sat in a valley between two ridgelines, the kind of town where the gas station doubled as the post office, and the only stoplight on Main Street had been blinking yellow for so long that nobody remembered when it last cycled green. Northgate Memorial Hospital served the county and 3 adjacent ones, which meant it handled everything from ranch injuries to overdoses to the occasional hunting accident that walked through the doors trailing blood and excuses. It was not a glamorous place to practice medicine. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear. Megan Callahan had understood that when she applied for the position. She had driven through Red Creek twice before accepting the job, once to look at the town, once to make sure she could live in it without flinching. She had rented a 2-bedroom house on the east end of Spruce Lane, learned which diner had decent coffee before 6 a.m., and started her first shift at Northgate Memorial with her hair pulled back, her scrubs pressed, and her face arranged into the particular expression she had practiced for exactly this kind of beginning: pleasant, capable, unremarkable. 3 years later, she was still wearing it. The charge nurse on the morning shift was a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who had worked at Northgate for 11 years and had the kind of institutional memory that made her simultaneously indispensable and exhausting. Sandra knew every doctor's preference, every patient's history, every unspoken rule in the building. She also knew, in the way that experienced nurses always know, that Megan Callahan was better than she let on. "You're on intake again," Sandra told her on a Tuesday in late October, handing over the shift board without looking up. "Vance wants the trauma bays covered by his residents until noon." "That's fine," Megan said. It wasn't fine. It was a deliberate insult dressed up as a scheduling decision, and both of them knew it. Dr. Richard Vance, Northgate's chief of emergency medicine, had been rerouting Megan away from serious cases for nearly a year. He did it cleanly, always through official channels, always with a plausible operational justification. He never said anything she could report. He never had to. "Callahan," Sandra's voice dropped half a register, "you know you're better than intake." "I know," Megan took the board. "But intake still needs to be done." She said it without self-pity, which was the part that made Sandra watch her walk away with something close to admiration and something closer to frustration. There was nothing dramatic about Megan Callahan. She did not complain in the break room or roll her eyes behind physicians' backs or position herself for recognition the way some of the younger nurses did. She worked her assignments, documented everything meticulously, and went home when her shift ended. She was also, Sandra had noticed, the only nurse on staff who never hesitated during a code. Most people hesitated. It wasn't a character flaw. It was biology, the half-second gap between stimulus and response when the brain registered that something had gone catastrophically wrong and needed to categorize the threat before acting. Megan didn't have that gap. She moved before the monitor alarmed, before the attending called for intervention, before anyone else in the room had fully processed what was happening. Sandra had mentioned it once to Dr. Elliot Marsh, one of the senior physicians who actually treated the nursing staff like colleagues. Marsh had nodded slowly and said, "She's been in real emergencies before. You can't fake that kind of timing." Sandra hadn't asked what kind. Neither had anyone else. The morning was ordinary until it wasn't. Intake moved at the usual pace. A fractured wrist from a fall on ice. A respiratory infection in a man who had been coughing for 3 weeks before his wife forced him to come in. Two minors with the same stomach complaint that was almost certainly the school cafeteria's problem to solve. Megan processed them efficiently, documented, communicated with the attending on call, and did not look at the trauma bay doors when she heard voices rising behind them. She was writing up the respiratory case when Dr. Vance appeared at the intake desk. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that had calcified into arrogance sometime in his 40s and never found its way back. His hair was silver and precise. His coat was always clean. He carried himself through Northgate like the building had been constructed specifically to provide him a backdrop, and he spoke to nursing staff with the particular brand of dismissiveness that stopped just short of actionable. Never a slur, never a direct insult, just a consistent, grinding devaluation that wore people down over months and years until they started to believe it. Callahan. He stopped at the desk without looking at her chart work. I need the intake roster updated before the department head meeting. The format you used last week was insufficient. Megan looked up. I followed the template. The template is a minimum standard, not a ceiling. He said it the way he said most things to her, as though she were a first-year student who had submitted work below expectations. Reformat it. I need it by 10. My shift ends at 9:30. Then you'll need to stay. He walked away before she could respond. Megan watched him go, then looked back at her screen and continued typing. Her expression didn't change. Her hands didn't tighten on the keyboard. She finished the respiratory documentation, pulled up the intake roster, and began reformatting it. Across the desk, a younger nurse named Davis, first name Kyle, 26, 3 months on the floor, watched the exchange with the look of someone who had witnessed something they hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with it. He can't just make you stay past your shift, Kyle said quietly. He can ask. You're going to do it? Megan hit save on the updated roster. The work still needs to get done. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it again, and went back to his own station. He had learned, slowly, that offering Megan Callahan sympathy was not something she particularly wanted. She wasn't cold. She was warm with patience in a way that surprised people who had only observed her from a distance. But she had a particular self-containment that kept most personal conversations from going anywhere. The morning rolled on. At 9:47, the radio crackled at the nurse's station. Sandra picked it up, listened, and her face changed in the way that experienced emergency staff faces changed. Not panic, not alarm, but a rapid recalibration, a shifting of every internal priority in the space of a breath. Multiple vehicle convoy, military, accident on Route 9 west of the ridge, ETA 14 minutes, trauma activation. She was already moving when she finished the sentence, turning to the floor. All hands. Trauma 1 and 2, clear them now. The convoy had been transporting soldiers from a training exercise at a facility 40 miles north. The accident report that came in fragments over the radio described a secondary vehicle losing traction on ice, a chain reaction collision, and at least 6 wounded personnel with 1 in critical condition. When the first ambulance arrived, it came in fast, and the paramedic who jumped out was talking before the doors were fully open. Critical in Bay 1. Tension pneumo. I'm almost certain. Breath sounds absent right. Trachea is shifting. Pressure dropping. He's been breathing, but it's laboring. He's 23 years old. The attending on call was Dr. Priya Okafor, a competent physician who was good under pressure and had less than 3 years of emergency medicine experience. She moved to Bay 1, called for a chest tray, and began her assessment. Megan had come to the trauma bay when the activation sounded. She was not assigned there. Vance had been clear about that. But she had come anyway, positioned herself at the edge of the organized chaos, and was watching the young soldier on the gurney with the focused attention of someone running calculations. His name, she heard from the second paramedic, was Specialist Aaron Greer. 23. No prior injuries. The color of his face was wrong, not pale the way shock made people pale, but the particular blue-gray tint that came when oxygenated blood stopped reaching tissue efficiently. His neck veins were distended. His trachea had deviated. It was a textbook tension pneumothorax. The chest tray hadn't arrived yet. The supply runner had taken a wrong turn in the corridor. Dr. Okafor called for it again, louder. Greer's oxygen saturation dropped 3 points in the time it took to call. Megan was already moving. She was at the head of the gurney with a large bore needle, pulled from the crash cart 2 steps to her left, before anyone in the room had fully processed what was happening. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, identified it with two fingertips the way someone did when they had done it before without gloves, without light, without a clean surface or a proper tray, and she decompressed. The hiss of released pressure was audible. Aaron Greer's oxygen saturation began climbing. The room was very quiet. Dr. Okafor looked at the monitor, then at Megan, then at the patient. Chest tube, she said, because that was the next step and she was a physician who kept moving. But her eyes stayed on Megan for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. The chest tray arrived 40 seconds later. Megan stepped back, stripped her gloves, and moved to the position of someone who was not the person who had just performed that intervention. Off to the side, documenting, already invisible again. She almost made it. Callahan. She turned. Vance was standing in the doorway of Bay 1. He had come at the sound of the trauma activation, the way chiefs always did when military personnel were involved, because there were political considerations and administrative optics and a dozen other reasons that had nothing to do with patient care. He had arrived in time to see the end of what she had done. His face was a specific kind of controlled that Megan recognized as more dangerous than anger. "In my office," he said. "Now." "The patient isn't stable. Dr. Okafor has the patient." His voice was flat. "My office. Now." Vance's office was on the third floor, which meant a walk through the main corridor and an elevator ride during which Megan stood with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing even. And Vance stood with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the floor indicator like it had personally offended him. The office was large enough to remind everyone who entered it that the person behind the desk had institutional power. Degrees on one wall, commendations on another, a desk that cost more than most of the nursing staff made in a month. Vance sat behind it. Megan did not sit down. "That was an unauthorized clinical intervention," he said. "That was emergency decompression of a tension pneumothorax in a patient who would have died in the next 90 seconds. You are a nurse, Callahan, not a physician. You do not perform independent procedures without attending authorization. There was no time for— There is never a circumstance," he said, leaning forward, "where you bypass the chain of clinical authority in this hospital. Not for a soldier. Not for anyone. Do you understand what you've done? If that patient had a complication, he didn't. You don't know that yet. I know the procedure was indicated. I know the technique was correct. And I know that if I had waited for the chest tray, we would be having a very different conversation right now." Vance was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, lower, more deliberate. "I've been watching you since you transferred to this department. You're competent. You follow instructions when it suits you, but you have a pattern of overstepping, and I've made allowances because the work product is acceptable." He paused. "I'm done making allowances. You're suspending me. I'm placing you on administrative review, effective immediately. Your clinical privileges are restricted pending the outcome. You'll receive the documentation by end of day." He sat back. "You may go." Megan looked at him for a moment, not with rage, not with tears, not with the theatrical wounded dignity that the moment might have invited. She looked at him the way she might look at a clinical problem, clearly, directly, assessing what was actually there. "I've been invisible in this building for 3 years, she said. "You made sure of that." Vance said nothing. "I let you." She picked up her badge from where she had set it on the edge of his desk. A habit, she always set it down when she entered a superior's office, and looked at it for a second. "That was my mistake." She walked out. The report on Aaron Greer came through at 11:40. He was stable, extubated, expected to make a full recovery. Dr. Okafor had signed off on the chest tube placement. The summary note documented the initial emergency decompression without attribution, which was standard, and which meant Megan's name appeared nowhere in the clinical record for the intervention that had saved his life. She read it in the break room, sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Kyle Davis sat down across from her. He looked like he had been working up to something for the past hour. "Word's already around the floor," he said. "I know. Vance is telling people you violated protocol." "He's right that I did." She set the cup down. "Protocol exists for good reasons. I made a judgment call." "You saved that kid's life." "That doesn't automatically make the call right." She said it flatly, without self-pity. "It means the outcome was good. Those aren't the same thing." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "You've done that before," he said. That specific procedure, the way you moved. You've done that before, haven't you? Megan looked at him. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility. She thought about the way she had packed away a version of herself that had survived things Kyle Davis had probably never imagined and would hopefully never have to. She thought about the specific discipline of becoming smaller than you were, and how long it took, and how much it cost. "Drink your coffee," she said. "Your break's almost over." She was gathering her things from her locker at 12:15 when Sandra came to find her. "There's something happening at the main entrance," Sandra said. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone describing something they hadn't yet categorized. Something. Military. A handler came in asking about the convoy survivors. He had a dog with him. Sandra paused. The dog got away from him. Megan closed her locker. She walked to the main corridor and stopped. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, lean, dark-muzzled, with the particular alert carriage of a working animal that had been well-trained and was currently operating outside its training. He had come through the emergency entrance at some point in the preceding minutes, bypassing the handler who was now at the desk talking rapidly to the front staff, and he was in the middle of the main corridor moving with focused, deliberate purpose. He was not circling. He was not sniffing randomly. He was tracking. People had moved aside. There was a half circle of hospital staff and visitors watching from a respectful distance, because military working dogs had a reputation, and this one had a presence that communicated very clearly that it knew exactly what it was doing. The dog stopped. He had stopped in front of Megan Callahan. She had not moved when he appeared. She stood at the entrance to the corridor with her bag over one shoulder and her coat half on, and when the dog reached her, she went very still. Not with fear, with something that looked more like recognition. The Malinois sat. He held something in his mouth. She could see it now as he dropped it at her feet with the precision of an animal that had been trained to deliver objects, but was choosing this moment without instruction. It was a piece of fabric, worn, scorched along one edge, still carrying a faded patch on the upper surface. She crouched down slowly. She picked it up. The patch read, "Ghost 1." Megan stayed crouched for a moment, her hand closed around the armband. Around her, the corridor had gone quiet in the particular way that large spaces went quiet when everyone present understood that something was happening, but none of them knew what it was. She looked up. The dog was watching her with amber eyes that held no confusion, no uncertainty, no mistake. He had come a long way. He had found what he was looking for. Across the corridor, Dr. Vance had emerged from the elevator. He stood at the far end, watching, with the administrative review paperwork still in his hand. Megan stood up. She was still holding the armband, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not look away. The dog didn't move. Neither did Megan. The corridor held its breath around them. Visitors pressed against the walls, nurses frozen mid-step, someone's paper cup hitting the floor, and nobody bending to pick it up. Vance stood at the far end with the paperwork still in his hand, and the expression on his face had shifted into something she had never seen there before. Not anger. Not the controlled contempt he deployed so efficiently. Something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like uncertainty. The handler reached them 30 seconds later, a young staff sergeant named Briggs, mid-20s, breathing hard from the run through the corridor. He grabbed the dog's lead and snapped it to the collar with practiced hands, already forming an apology. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't know what happened. He just bolted. He's never done that." "What's his name?" Megan asked. Briggs blinked. "Ranger, ma'am." She looked down at the Malinois. Ranger sat with the lead now attached to his collar, and the absolute absence of apology in his posture, watching her with amber eyes that held the same fixed attention as when he had crossed the corridor alone. She had the armband in her hand. The fabric was rough, stiff, in places where something had dried into it a long time ago. She didn't think about what. And the Ghost 1 patch was sun-bleached along the upper edge, but intact. "Where did he get this?" she asked. "He's had it," Briggs said slowly. It was in his crate from his last deployment rotation. The handlers before me said he carried it sometimes. I honestly don't know where it originally came from." He paused. "Do you know what it is?" Megan straightened up. She put the armband in her coat pocket. "Yes," she said, and didn't add anything to that. Briggs looked at her, then at Ranger, then at her again with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. Before he could ask the next question, Sandra Pruitt appeared at Megan's elbow with the look of a woman who had decided that whatever was happening needed to be moved out of the main corridor before it became a problem the hospital administrator would hear about. "Let's get the dog into the family consultation room," Sandra said. "He's making the visitors nervous." Ranger was not making the visitors nervous. He was making the visitors intensely curious, which was arguably worse. But Megan followed Sandra without argument, and Briggs followed with Ranger, and by the time they reached the family consultation room, beige walls, institutional carpet, a box of tissues on every flat surface, the three of them had left most of the audience behind. Vance had not followed.
Is it?
Sandra closed the door, looked at Briggs, then looked at Megan, then did the thing she was very good at, which was extracting information efficiently without appearing to interrogate anyone. "The convoy's here for Specialist Greer and 2 others," she said. "I'm assuming this is related." "We came in to check on our guys," Briggs confirmed. "Ranger. He's been with our unit for 2 years. He's trained for search and recovery, some specialized tracking work. When we came through the entrance, he just went. I've never seen him do that with a civilian before." He was looking at Megan while he said it, making it a question without framing it as one. Megan sat down in one of the consultation chairs. Ranger immediately moved to sit beside her left knee, pressing lightly against her leg, and she put her hand on his head without thinking about it. The automatic gesture of someone who had done exactly that many times, in many places, and hadn't done it in years. Briggs watched that. "Ghost 1, he said carefully. "That's a call sign." "Yes." "For a unit." "Yes." "Are you—" He stopped. Started again. "Ma'am, were you military?" The question sat in the room. Sandra was very still. Ranger's ears were forward. Megan had spent 3 years answering that question by not answering it, by changing the subject or saying something vague about her nursing background and letting people draw their own conclusions. She was good at it. She had practiced it until it was reflexive. But the armband was in her coat pocket, and the dog's head was warm under her hand, and somewhere down the corridor a 23-year-old soldier was breathing on his own because of timing she couldn't have faked. "Combat medic," she said. 3 deployments. I was attached to a special operations support unit. Ghost 1 was my team's designation." Sandra exhaled through her nose. Not surprise exactly, but the sound of a decade of small observations clicking into place. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "When did you separate?" 4 years ago. "And you've been here since?" 3 years here," she paused. "I needed something quieter." Briggs looked at Ranger, who had not moved from her side. "He would have been assigned during your last rotation. The dog, I mean. If the timing matches." Megan looked down at Ranger. He looked back up at her, and there was something in the way he held himself. The specific tension of an animal that had been waiting for a particular thing and had finally found it, that made her throat tighten in a way she wasn't expecting. "He remembers me," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Not a dramatic revelation, just a fact stated plainly, the way you might note that it was raining or that a patient was running a fever. But Sandra heard the weight in it, and Briggs heard it, and nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Megan stood up, because sitting still while something moved through her was not a thing she did comfortably. "I have to go clear out my workspace. I've been placed on administrative review." "What?" Sandra's voice sharpened. "Vance, the intervention in Bay 1. Megan pulled her coat straight. "He's not wrong that I bypassed procedure. The outcome was good, but that doesn't—" "The outcome was that Kid is alive," Sandra said flatly. "You want to tell me Vance put you on review for that?" "For performing an independent procedure without attending authorization, which is what I did." She said it without bitterness, which was perhaps the most aggravating thing about Megan Callahan in moments like this. She refused to perform her own victimhood. "It'll work out, or it won't. Either way, I'll deal with it." She said goodbye to Briggs, scratched Ranger once behind the ear. The dog pressed into her hand and made a sound low in his chest, and walked out of the consultation room. She made it approximately 30 feet down the corridor before her legs told her to stop, so she stopped, and stood with one hand pressed against the wall and her eyes closed for about 4 seconds, which was as long as she permitted herself. Then she kept walking. The administrative review documentation was waiting in her inbox by 2 p.m., as Vance had promised. Megan read through it at the small desk in the outpatient office she had been using since the transfer, a room with one window overlooking the parking lot, a chair that needed a new wheel on the left rear caster, and a desktop computer that was 2 hardware generations behind the main floor machines. She had never complained about the office. The review cited 4 specific items: performing an invasive procedure without attending authorization, failure to follow established triage protocol, potential patient endangerment, and this one she read twice, pattern of behavior inconsistent with established scope of nursing practice. That last item was broader than the others. Broader meant it was meant to accumulate. Laura Mercer arrived at 4:15. Laura was the chief nursing officer, 51, a woman who had climbed her way through hospital administration by being organized, politically careful, and genuinely convinced that the institutional structure was always worth protecting over the individual inside it. She wasn't cruel. She was worse than cruel in some ways. She was sincerely bureaucratic, which meant her damage was always perfectly documented. "I've reviewed the initial report," Laura said, sitting across from Megan with a tablet in her lap, and the expression of someone delivering news they considered regrettable but necessary. "I want to be clear that this is not a punitive action. It's a process. The review board will convene within 5 business days, and you'll have the opportunity to present your account." "I understand the process," Megan said. "You're suspended with pay pending the review. I'll need your badge." Megan took the badge from around her neck and set it on the desk between them. Laura picked it up and placed it in a small envelope she produced from her bag, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. She had. "Is there anything you want to say for the record at this stage?" Laura asked. Megan thought about it. "I made a clinical decision that violated protocol. I stand by the clinical decision, and I acknowledge the protocol violation. Those are both true at the same time." Laura wrote something on her tablet. "You're aware that your employment file doesn't contain any documentation of prior military medical training. My employment file contains my nursing credentials and certifications, which are current and accurate. The procedures you performed suggest a level of training beyond standard nursing scope, which is why I'm on review." Megan kept her voice level. "Is there something specific you'd like me to explain?" Laura looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who suspected they were not getting the full picture but couldn't identify the gap precisely. "No," she said finally. "That's all for now." When she left, Megan sat in the office with the empty lanyard in her hands and looked at the parking lot through the window. The sky had gone the particular flat gray of Montana in late October, the kind of gray that wasn't dramatic, just persistent. She thought about Ranger pressing against her leg. She thought about the armband in her pocket. She thought about 3 years of becoming smaller than she was, and how it had felt like safety, and how it hadn't been. Kyle Davis found her in the parking lot at 4:45, on her way to her car. He was off shift and still in his street clothes, which meant he had waited for her on purpose. "People are talking," he said, falling into step beside her. "The staff, I mean. About what you did in Bay 1, about the review. I know. They're angry, Megan. They should stay out of it. That's not—" He stopped walking, which forced her to stop too. "That's not how it works. Sandra's been talking to people. The nurses who've been here longer than me. They've all got their own versions of things Vance has done. Reports that went nowhere. Complaints that got filed and then buried. One of the other residents told Sandra that Vance pressured him to sign off on a decision he didn't agree with 6 months ago, and he was too scared to say no." Megan looked at him. "Kyle. People are scared of him, Megan. They have been for years, and they're looking at what happened today, and they're saying, if she can get put on review for saving someone's life, then there's no incentive to ever do the right thing." It was the most she had ever heard Kyle Davis say in sequence. He was not a talker by nature. The fact that he had marshaled this many words meant he had been organizing them for some time. She turned it over in her mind. The parking lot was cold and the wind was coming off the ridge in the way it did in late October, carrying the smell of pine and ice, and she stood in it and thought about something she had been deliberately not thinking about. "If people start talking formally," she said, "it becomes an investigation. Investigations are uncomfortable for everyone involved. People lose shifts, they get moved around. Administration makes their lives difficult while it's ongoing." "Yeah," Kyle said. "It doesn't always end the way it should." "Yeah." "And Vance has been here 12 years. He has relationships with the board members. He has a documented track record that looks good on paper because he made sure it looks good on paper. She paused. It would be a real fight. I know. I'm not asking you to do that. I know you're not asking, Kyle said. That's not... Look, Megan, you've been here 3 years and you've never once asked anyone for anything. We see that. And maybe for a long time people just thought you were fine, self-sufficient, didn't need anything. He looked at her directly, which he didn't always do. But watching what he did to you today, watching you save that kid and then lose your badge in the same afternoon, it doesn't sit right with people. It shouldn't sit right with people. Megan looked at the ridgeline. There was a cloud moving across it with the slow, indifferent momentum of weather that didn't have opinions about what happened beneath it. Tell Sandra, she said finally, that if people have things they want to document, they should talk to HR themselves. Formal, individual, separate complaints. Not on my behalf. On their own behalf, for their own reasons. She paused. Whatever happened to me today is separate from whatever happened to them. Kyle nodded. He looked relieved in the way people looked relieved when someone finally stopped performing fine. One more thing, he said, and reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Someone left this at the nurse's station. For you, specifically. The woman who left it said her name was Whitaker. Megan read the note in her car with the engine running for heat. It was handwritten on paper with a military unit header that she recognized. Not Ghost One, but a command level above it. The handwriting was precise without being fussy, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who communicated economically by habit. Callahan, I know you're here. Ranger found you before I did. I have your file. I think it's time you and I talked. I'm at the Clearwater Lodge on Route 7, Room 14. Tomorrow at 0700 if you're willing. Whitaker, M.A.J. Megan folded the note and put it in her glove compartment. She sat for a moment. Major Claire Whitaker. She knew that name. She had known it in a different context, in a different life. Whitaker had been 2 levels up the command chain during Megan's second deployment, the kind of officer who read every report that crossed her desk and didn't forget what she read. The kind of officer who, Megan had always suspected, knew more about what happened during Ghost One's 3rd deployment than she had ever officially acknowledged. The kind of officer who would not drive to Red Creek, Montana, without a specific reason. Megan put the car in reverse and pulled out of the parking lot. She didn't sleep well. This was not unusual. She had a recurring pattern of light sleep and early waking that had started during her first deployment and had never fully resolved, the kind of thing therapists had polite words for, and medication could soften but not fix. She had learned to use the early hours rather than fight them. She made coffee. She ran through clinical notes she was reviewing for her nursing certification renewal. She let Ranger, who Briggs had, with some significant administrative improvisation, allowed to stay with her overnight because the dog had refused to get back in the transport vehicle, sleep on the floor beside the couch. He was good company. He didn't ask questions. By 5 a.m., she had made the decision she had already made the night before in the car. She would go. Not because she was certain it was right, but because not going was also a choice, and she was tired of making choices by subtraction. She arrived at the Clearwater Lodge at 6:58. Room 14 was in the back wing, ground floor. She knocked and heard movement immediately, which meant Whitaker had been awake and alert and probably standing near the door. The woman who opened it was 53, lean in the way that people who had spent decades in physically demanding work were lean, with silver at her temples and brown eyes that assessed Megan in approximately 2 seconds and found what they were looking for. "You look like hell," Whitaker said. "Thank you for the note," Megan said. "Come in." The room had been rearranged slightly. The desk pulled to face the window, paper spread across it in organized clusters. A laptop open with what looked like a scanned document on the screen. Whitaker had been working. There was one chair at the desk and one at the small table by the window, and she gestured to the table chair. "How long have you been tracking me?" Megan asked. "I wasn't tracking you. You were off my radar until 4 months ago when a congressional review of veteran healthcare deployment patterns flagged your nursing license registration in Montana." Whitaker sat. "Your separation from service was clean and your records were in order, so there was nothing to investigate. I noted it and moved on." She paused. "Then Ranger's unit rotated through Fort Bragg for reassignment processing, and his handler reported that the dog was carrying a piece of field gear that didn't belong to anyone in the current unit roster. I looked up the call sign on the patch. Ghost 1. Your team, your armband, based on the inventory from your third deployment. Whitaker's voice was even, informational, not warm but not cold. And then yesterday I got a second-hand report about an emergency intervention at Northgate Memorial in Red Creek, Montana, performed by a civilian nurse, describing a field decompression technique that isn't in standard nursing curricula. She looked at Megan steadily. So I drove. You drove 4 hours because a nurse performed a needle decompression. I drove 4 hours because Megan Callahan performed a needle decompression, and I needed to know why she was hiding in a county hospital in Montana. Whitaker's tone shifted fractionally, still even, but something underneath it that wasn't quite professional distance. I have your service record, the full one, not the summary. Megan was quiet. You were awarded the Army Commendation Medal with Valor for actions during your third deployment, Whitaker said. You saved 6 soldiers under direct enemy fire after your unit's primary medic was killed. You stabilized 4 critical patients with compromised equipment in a compromised location for 11 hours while waiting for extraction. She paused. The citation was never processed through official channels. It sat in a pending file for 2 years and then disappeared. I know, Megan said. Did you know why? Something moved across Megan's face, not surprise, but the specific expression of someone who had suspected a thing for a long time and was now being handed confirmation. I had a theory, she said. I'd like to hear it. Megan looked at the papers on the desk. She looked at the laptop screen, at the scanned document she couldn't quite read from her angle. She thought about the 18 months between the end of her third deployment and the date she signed her separation papers, during which she had filed a report that went nowhere, asked questions that were met with procedural silence, and finally understood that the institution she had served was not going to correct something it had decided to bury. There was a patient, she said, during the third deployment, a soldier named Ethan Cole. He was wounded in the same engagement where I lost my primary medic. His injuries were survivable. I know that because I assessed him. I know what survivable looks like, and his injuries were in that category. But there was a physician attached to the contractor medical unit operating in our sector. He triaged Cole as lower priority. Cole died before extraction reached him. And you reported it. I reported it, twice. Her voice stayed flat. The first report went to the contractor's internal review process. The second went to the unit chaplain's documentation system because it was the only channel left that didn't run through the contractor's oversight structure. She stopped. I never heard anything back. I separated 8 months later. Whitaker was very still. The physician attached to that contractor unit, she said carefully. What do you remember about him? Megan looked at her. She had carried this for 4 years. She had carried it so consistently and for so long that it had become part of the weight of ordinary existence, present enough to shape everything, invisible enough that no one around her could see it. I remember his face, she said. I remember his name. I didn't know until 9 months ago that he had a civilian medical career. She paused. I didn't know he was the chief of emergency medicine at Northgate Memorial until I had already accepted the position there. The silence in the room was a different kind than before. You didn't know Vance was there when you took the job, Whitaker said slowly. No. But Vance knew you. The pause was one breath long. He recognized me at my interview, Megan said. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, the way his behavior changed in the first 6 months, the specific way he started managing me out of high-visibility cases, yes, he knew exactly who I was. She pressed her hands flat on her knees, a grounding gesture. And I didn't say anything because I had no proof of anything, and because filing another complaint that goes nowhere is its own kind of damage, and because I thought if I stayed quiet and stayed small and did good work, it might just not matter. Did it work? Yesterday it cost me my badge. She let out a breath. So no. Whitaker leaned forward and turned the laptop so Megan could see the screen. The scanned document had a header she recognized, a military contractor medical services company, the same one that had been operating in their sector during the third deployment. Below the header was a name, and below the name was a service summary. She read it. Then she read it again. He was flagged, she said. During a routine contractor audit 18 months after the deployment you're describing. The flag was administrative, cite documentation irregularities and triage records. It was not escalated. Whitaker's voice carried something careful in it, the tone of someone delivering information that implicated a system they were part of. The audit was closed internally. Vance's contractor relationship ended at the conclusion of that engagement, and he transitioned back to civilian medical practice without the flag appearing in his credentialing review. Because nobody connected it. Because the systems don't talk to each other the way they should. Whitaker closed the laptop. Callahan, I came here to offer you a position. I've been building a civilian-military medical liaison program, working with rural hospitals and emergency services, and your profile is exactly what we need. That offer is still open. She paused. But I also came because you are the only person who was present for what happened to Ethan Cole, who has the documentation to support a formal reopening of that case. Megan sat with that. My testimony is the documentation, she said. Your testimony plus the report you filed, which exists in a chaplain's records archive and was never officially suppressed. It just wasn't forwarded. Plus the contractor audit flag, which I now have a copy of. Whitaker's eyes were steady. It's not nothing. It's not enough. Not yet. The wind outside had picked up. Megan could hear it against the window, the particular tone of Montana wind in late October when it had nothing to break against for miles. I need to think, she said. I know. Take the time you need. Whitaker stood. The meeting was over, or this part of it was. But be aware that Vance knows your suspension changes the political landscape. You had institutional cover as a functioning employee. On review, you're exposed in a different way. I know what exposure feels like, Megan said, and stood. She was at the door when Whitaker spoke again. The 6 soldiers from the 3rd deployment, the ones you kept alive for 11 hours. A pause. 3 of them are still active duty. 1 of them works in my office. Megan's hand was on the door handle. He asked me, Whitaker said, when I told him where I was going, he asked me to tell you he still wears the tourniquet you put on him, as a reminder. Another pause. His words, not mine. Megan opened the door and walked out into the cold Montana morning and did not let what was moving through her chest show on her face until she was far enough from the building that it didn't matter. She was back at her house on Spruce Lane by 9 a.m. Ranger was waiting inside. Briggs had dropped a key with the neighbor, and he met her at the door with the same particular attention he'd had since the corridor, the fixed, patient watchfulness of an animal that had done its job and wasn't leaving until it was certain she understood that. She fed him. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the armband in front of her and thought about Ethan Cole, who had died in a sector she had tried to hold together with compromised equipment and inadequate support, and about the report she had filed twice and the silence that had followed, and about the 12-year career Richard Vance had built on the grave of something he had done and walked away from. Her phone rang at 10:47. It was Sandra. I need you to hear this directly, Sandra said. I've spent the morning talking to staff, quietly, carefully. Megan, I have 7 nurses and 2 residents who have documented incidents involving Vance. Not verbal complaints, written, dated, with specifics. They've been keeping their own records because they didn't trust the official channels. Megan said nothing. And Vance is gone, Sandra added. He was in the building this morning, and then he wasn't. Nobody's seen him since 11. His administrative assistant says he took a personal day, which he has never done midweek without 2 weeks' notice in 12 years. The kitchen was quiet. Ranger raised his head from the floor where he'd been lying and looked at her. Did anyone check on him? Megan asked carefully. His assistant called his phone. No answer. Sandra's voice had the particular controlled quality of someone communicating something serious without alarming anyone who might be overhearing. Nobody's worried yet. He's an adult. He can take a personal day. But, Sandra, yeah. Lock Ranger's transport crate. A pause. The word came out before the thought fully formed, but once it was out, it was right. Wherever Briggs is keeping it, lock it and check it. A silence. Why? Sandra asked. Megan was already standing, her coat in her hand. Because Vance knew the dog was here, she said. He was in the corridor yesterday. He saw everything. She was moving toward the door. And if he recognized what it meant, if he understands what I know and what I can prove, then he's not taking a personal day. Megan, what are you— Call Briggs, Megan said. Right now. Call him and tell him to check on Ranger's transport crate. She was in her car before Sandra could answer. Her phone buzzed 40 seconds later. A text from Briggs' number. Crate's been broken into. Ranger's gear is gone. And there's a note. She pulled up the message that followed. A photo. A piece of paper, torn from something. 4 words in heavy block letters written in black marker. You took everything. Now run. Megan stared at it. Then she looked at the dog in her passenger seat, because Ranger had gotten into the car when she opened the door, and she had not stopped him, and he was sitting with his eyes forward and his ears up, already watching the road ahead. She put the car in drive. The road west of Red Creek was 2 lanes and mostly empty at that hour, bordered on both sides by pine stands that pushed close to the shoulder and blocked the sky into a narrow gray strip overhead. Megan drove with her phone on the seat beside her and Ranger sitting upright in the passenger position, his nose tracking something through the crack she had left in the window. 2 inches of cold air and whatever information it carried that she couldn't access. She called Whitaker at the first straightaway. Whitaker picked up on the second ring. Callahan. Vance is gone. He left the hospital mid-morning, no explanation, and someone broke into the military transport area and took gear from Ranger's secured crate. Megan kept her voice measured. There was a note. What did it say? She read it from the photo on her phone. 4 words. Whitaker was quiet for a beat that was 1 beat longer than pure processing time. Where are you? Driving west on Route 9. I don't have a destination yet. I'm moving because staying still felt wrong. That instinct is probably correct. Whitaker's voice shifted into the register Megan remembered from operational briefings. Less conversational, more structured. I'm going to make 2 calls. Don't go anywhere remote without telling me first. Do you have a sidearm? No. A pause. I do. I'll meet you on Route 9. Pull over at the junction with County Road 14 and wait for me. 15 minutes. Whitaker? 14 minutes now. Drive. Megan drove. She thought while she drove about the logical architecture of what Vance was doing. He had recognized her in the corridor. He had seen Ranger identify her, had watched her pick up the armband, had processed in real time what it meant that the dog had crossed a hospital corridor to find the woman who had once filed a report about Ethan Cole. He had spent 12 years building institutional armor, credentials, relationships, a career that looked, on every surface that mattered, like a success story. And now a suspended nurse and a military working dog and a major who had driven 4 hours to knock on a motel room door had walked into that structure in the same 24-hour window. He wasn't taking a personal day. He was calculating. The question was what he thought he could do. A man like Vance, institutional, political, accustomed to managing threats through paperwork and procedure, didn't naturally move toward direct confrontation. He managed. He maneuvered. The note wasn't a threat in the way a threat from a violent person was a threat. It was the kind of message someone sent when they wanted to destabilize, when they wanted the other person off balance and reactive, unless destabilization was the first move, not the only one. Megan pulled over at the County Road 14 junction and waited. Ranger pressed his nose fully into the window gap and held very still, reading the air, and she watched him rather than the rearview mirror because the dog's attention was more reliable than her own peripheral processing. Whitaker's vehicle, a dark blue government-plated SUV, arrived in 11 minutes. She pulled in behind Megan and was out of the driver's door before the engine fully settled. Talk, Whitaker said, leaning against Megan's passenger door. Ranger acknowledged her with a brief nose touch and went back to the window. Megan laid it out clean and in order. The timeline of Vance's behavior since her hire, the pattern of removal from high-visibility cases, the recognition she had not registered at first but understood in retrospect, and the specific geography of what he now knew she could prove. Whitaker listened without interrupting, which was a skill not everyone had. He's not running, Whitaker said when she finished. A man running doesn't leave a note. A man running gets on a plane. He left his car in the hospital lot, Megan said. Sandra confirmed it's still there. So someone picked him up or he left on foot, which means he's local. Whitaker pushed off the door and looked up the road. Does he have property out here? Secondary residence? Family land? I don't know his personal life. I'll find out. Whitaker was already on her phone, moving back toward her vehicle. Stay on this road. Don't go anywhere alone. She had the information in 4 minutes. A fact that reminded Megan of how much faster things moved when you had institutional access and knew which systems to query. Whitaker came back to the window with her phone screen turned outward. He purchased a parcel of land 8 years ago, 22 acres off a logging road 7 miles west of where we're standing. There's a structure on it. County records describe it as a storage and equipment building, which could mean anything. She paused. There's also a decommissioned medical supply depot on the same parcel, sold by a regional health authority to a private buyer in 2019. The buyer's name is a Shell LLC that traces back to Vance through 2 intermediaries. A decommissioned medical facility, remote location, a man who had spent 12 years performing competence while concealing something that could end him. Megan thought about what Whitaker had said in the motel room. You are the only person who was present for what happened to Ethan Cole, who has the documentation to support a formal reopening of that case. She thought about the note. He's not planning to run, she said. He's planning to remove the problem. That's my read too. Whitaker's voice was flat, which is why we're not going out there alone and we're not going out there unprepared. I'm calling my contact at the county sheriff's office. I have a federal attachment that gives me some leverage on jurisdiction. This takes 30 minutes to organize properly. 30 minutes is 30 minutes he has that we don't. 30 minutes is the difference between a coordinated response and 2 women and a dog walking into an unknown structure with one sidearm. Whitaker held her gaze. I know you can hold your own. I also know you're not currently armed and you haven't slept properly and you've had approximately the worst 48 hours possible. We do this right. Megan sat with it. The part of her that had operated in hostile environments for 3 deployments was running its own calculation. Threat proximity, response time, the particular cost of waiting. When the variable you couldn't control was what an increasingly cornered man decided to do next. But Whitaker wasn't wrong about the arithmetic. 30 minutes, she said. It took 37. The county sheriff sent 2 vehicles, Deputy Wren Falconer, who was competent and local and knew the logging roads, and a second deputy named Holt, who was younger and less certain but followed Falconer's lead without creating friction. Whitaker briefed them in 3 minutes. No speculation, just facts. A suspended hospital employee had left his workplace without notice following the discovery of a covered military gear break-in, had a parcel of property in the area, and had left a written communication suggesting potential threat behavior. It was enough for a welfare check with backup. They drove in convoy, Falconer's vehicle leading, then Whitaker, then Megan with Ranger. The logging road was narrow and rutted, the pine canopy closing over it after the first quarter mile and dropping the available light by half. Megan drove the ruts without losing ground clearance, which was not difficult if you had experience with worse roads in worse conditions, and she kept her eyes moving between the track ahead and the tree lines on both sides. Ranger had stopped looking out the window. He was facing forward, fully upright, ears forward, the specific posture of a working dog that had shifted from passive tracking to active alert. Whatever his nose had been cataloging from the 2-inch window gap, he had processed enough of it to reach a conclusion. She noted it. She didn't say anything. The structure came into view at the end of a clearing. A low, wide building that had been designed for utility rather than permanence, metal-sided, with loading bay doors on the south end that had been padlocked from the outside and a regular entry door on the east face. There were no windows on the ground level. A generator cable ran from the east side to a portable unit parked 15 feet away, and the generator was running. He was inside. Falconer put his vehicle in park and got out slowly, hand at his belt but not on his weapon, and spoke in the measured way of someone who had been trained to de-escalate without appearing to de-escalate. Dr. Vance? Sheriff's Department. We're checking on you, sir. Nothing. Dr. Vance, if you're in the building, please make yourself known. A sound from inside, not a voice, something else, something lower, and then a scrape of metal against metal. Ranger made a sound in his chest that Megan had not heard from him before. Not aggression, something with more distress in it. She was out of the car before she consciously decided to move. Callahan? Whitaker's voice, sharp. He's got Ranger's gear in there, Megan said, and she was already crossing the clearing because the sound the dog had made was a sound she knew, and what it was telling her was that the thing inside the building was not an ambush waiting for the humans. It was an animal that was in trouble. Falconer caught up to her at the door. Let me go first, he said. Not a request, but also not aggressive. Just the clear statement of someone doing their job. She let him. He tried the handle. Unlocked. The door opened into a long rectangular space that smelled of medical-grade disinfectant over the base odor of a building that had been sealed and unused for years. The generator powered 2 banks of industrial lights on the ceiling, both on, flooding the space in flat white. Equipment was stored along the walls, old examination tables, shelving that held empty supply boxes. At the far end, against the back wall, a dog crate had been set up, large, double-latched, the kind designed for transport of working animals. Inside it, a Belgian Malinois lay on his side, breathing in the labored, shallow pattern of an animal that had been sedated. Not Ranger. A second dog. Similar markings. Younger. One of the other working dogs from the convoy unit. One that Megan hadn't met but recognized by breed and by the military-issue collar still around his neck. Ranger had gone rigid beside her. Megan crossed the space in 10 steps and crouched at the crate. The dog's mucous membranes were pale but not white, his respiratory rate shallow but not arrested, pupils reactive when she produced her phone light and checked. Sedated, she said. Probably ketamine based on the muscle tone. He needs monitoring, but he's not crashing. Callahan. Falconer's voice from behind her had changed register. She turned. Richard Vance was standing in a doorway she had not seen, a second internal door, previously closed, now open. He was in civilian clothes, which made him look both more and less like himself, and he was holding a gun that was not a hunting rifle and not a service weapon, but something in between, a semi-automatic pistol that he was holding with the two-handed grip of someone who had been to a range but was not a trained operator. His hands were not entirely steady. "Close the door," he said to Falconer. "Put the radio on the floor." Falconer assessed the gun, the hands, the distance, and complied. He was smart enough to know that a scared man with an unsteady weapon was more dangerous than a calm one. "Richard." Megan stood up slowly. She kept her voice even and clinical, the tone she used when a patient was escalating and she needed to pull them back from the edge of something they couldn't undo. "This is not the direction you want to go. You don't get to tell me what direction to go." His voice was strained in the way of someone who had been managing extreme internal pressure for hours. "You've been in this town for 3 years. 3 years, and you never said anything. And I thought you'd decided it wasn't worth it. I thought you'd let it go." "I had let it go," she said, which was true and also not the point. "And then that dog walked across the hospital and dropped that armband at your feet in front of everyone." He said it with a specific edge of disbelief, the tone of a man who felt that the universe had arranged things against him through no fault of his own. "Do you understand what that looked like? Do you understand what people started asking?" "What did they ask you, Richard?" "Nothing yet." He said it with the awareness that yet was the operative word. "But Whitaker drove here, and you've been talking to people. And my attorney called me this morning and said there was a flag in a contractor audit that someone had requested copies of." His grip shifted on the weapon. "Someone who had federal clearance to request it." Megan registered the distance between them, 12 feet, roughly. The crated dog on the floor to her left. Ranger somewhere behind her, she could hear him breathing. Falconer to her right at the door, his radio on the floor, his posture the controlled stillness of someone waiting for an opening. She needed Vance talking. Talking was time. Time was Whitaker, who had not come through the door, which meant she was outside and either calling for more support or preparing her own approach, or both. "Tell me about Ethan Cole," Megan said. The name landed visibly. His jaw tightened. "That's not what this is about." "It's exactly what this is about. It's the only thing this has ever been about." She kept her voice steady. Not accusatory, not emotional. The same flat, clear tone she used when she needed information from a patient who was resistant. "You triaged him low. I assessed him and I flagged it. You overrode my assessment. He died before extraction. The triage decision was within acceptable parameters. The triage decision was wrong, and you knew it was wrong." She didn't raise her voice. "The contractor audit found documentation irregularities in your triage records from that sector. Not mine, yours. The timing, the classifications, the sequence of who got what and when. It doesn't add up unless someone was prioritizing cases based on something other than clinical need." His expression did something complicated. There were 15 patients in that sector, he said, and it came out with the quality of something he had been rehearsing for years. 15 with compromised supply lines and one functional surgical unit and 3 physicians covering a geographic area that should have had 7. Every triage decision in that environment was a calculation. I know that. She meant it. I know what those calculations cost. I made them too. She paused. But Ethan Cole's injuries were a grade 2 hemorrhagic pattern with a manageable airway compromise. I documented that. You reclassified him downward. And 6 hours later, he was dead of blood loss that was preventable if he'd been moved up the priority chain. You can't prove intent. The audit can prove documentation irregularities. My contemporaneous notes, filed through the chaplain system, can establish what I assessed and when. The contractor audit flag, which now has federal attention, establishes that your records didn't match the clinical reality on the ground. She let it sit for a second. You don't need intent. You need pattern. Something shifted in his face. The particular shift of someone who has been managing a calculation and has just arrived at a number they don't like. I built a career, he said, 12 years of a career. A department, systems, training programs for residents. I trained residents, Callahan. I produced competent physicians. I know. And one engagement, one sector, with 15 patients and no resources, and a timeline that no one could have managed perfectly. You're right that no one could have managed it perfectly, she said. I wasn't asking for perfect. I was asking for Ethan Cole. The gun came up slightly. Falconer made an infinitesimal shift of weight. Megan did not move. Lower the weapon, Richard. She said it with the same voice she used for everything. Not soft, not commanding, just clear. Not for me. Because you are a physician who has, in the past 12 years, done genuine good for genuine patients. And if you fire that gun right now, nothing that comes after is survivable. Not for you, not the way you want to survive. He was shaking now. Not a lot, but enough. You destroyed everything, he said. Yesterday. In that corridor. Everything I built. The board. The relationships. The department. One dog. One piece of fabric. And it was already built on something unstable, she said. You've known that for 12 years. The silence stretched. Ranger moved. He came from behind Megan's left side. Not lunging, not the explosive trained attack response, but a deliberate measured pace that covered the ground between them and placed him between Megan and Vance in the specific way that trained protection dogs did when they assessed a threat to their person. He sat. He fixed his eyes on Vance with the absolute unhurried attention of an animal that had made a decision and was communicating it without drama. Vance looked at the dog. Something in him changed. Not completely, not cleanly, but the way of a person who encounters something that cuts through the noise of their own internal catastrophe. He's going to attack me, Vance said. He's not, Megan said. He's telling you something. A beat. Richard, put the gun down. He looked at Ranger for a long moment. Then the door behind him, the internal door he had come through, opened, and Whitaker came through it from the other side of the building, service weapon drawn and leveled, her voice completely flat and completely certain. Dr. Vance, drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them. Now. He startled. The gun moved. Not toward Whitaker, not toward anyone, but the involuntary jerk of a man whose nervous system had reached capacity. It was 1 second. Megan covered the 12 feet. She had crossed worse distances faster in worse conditions, and the technique she used was not elegant and not from any civilian defensive training manual. It was the specific, efficient method of someone who had been taught to disarm a distracted threat in the field, and it worked because it was designed to work when the variables were exactly what they were: an unsteady grip, a redirected attention, and a person moving from outside the operator's focal point. She had the weapon. She stepped back, put it on the floor behind her. Falconer was already moving, already talking, already producing the restraints from his belt with the practiced motion of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. Vance did not fight. He folded rather than collapsed. The controlled, exhausted surrender of a man who had spent all of his remaining capacity on the preceding hour and had nothing left. Falconer had the cuffs on him in seconds. Holt materialized through the main door and Whitaker was already on her radio, calling the sequence of notifications that a federal military attaché called when a civilian with a contractor history had just drawn a weapon on a deputy sheriff and a decorated combat medic in a remote structure in Red Creek, Montana. The sedated dog in the crate breathed in and out. Ranger sat beside Megan and pressed his shoulder against her leg. She stood in the flat white light of the building and looked at Richard Vance with his hands restrained behind him and his face carrying the expression of a man who had finally stopped running from something he had been running from for 12 years. Not relief, not peace, just the specific blankness of a thing that is over. "I should have been honest in that sector," he said, to no one in particular. Megan didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with that would have meant anything useful. She turned and crouched by the crate and checked the sedated dog again. Respiratory rate, color, temperature of the paws, all within the range that said he had time. She spoke to him quietly while she checked, the low constant voice that animals responded to not for the words but for the tone, the signal that the person near them was not a threat. Falconer was outside calling for a veterinary service. Holt was documenting. Whitaker finished her radio sequence and came to stand beside Megan at the crate. "Good outcome," Whitaker said, quietly enough that it wasn't for anyone else. "Could have been better managed," Megan said. She meant the whole thing, the 37 minutes, the single sidearm, herself crossing 12 feet in a building with a man who was deteriorating in ways she had not fully predicted. "Yes," Whitaker agreed. "It also could have gone differently in the last 30 seconds. Ranger helped." Whitaker looked at the dog. "He did." They were quiet for a moment in the way that people were quiet after something ended that had the potential to end worse. Then Megan's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Sandra. A text. 3 words and a screenshot. The text read, "You need to see this." The screenshot was a document, hospital letterhead, board authorization header, the format of an emergency session resolution. Megan read it twice, then read the critical paragraph a third time to make sure she had the language right. The board of Northgate Memorial Hospital had convened an emergency session at 2:15 p.m. The session had been called in response to the formal complaints filed by 7 nursing staff members and 2 residents, citing a documented pattern of misconduct, clinical intimidation, falsification of incident reports, and retaliatory management practices spanning the tenure of Chief of Emergency Medicine Dr. Richard Vance. The emergency session had voted 7-2 to immediately escalate the matter to the State Medical Licensing Board and the hospital's external legal counsel, and to request that all pending administrative actions against nursing staff under Vance's authority be placed on hold pending review. One of the pending administrative actions was Megan's review. She read it a second time. Not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because 3 years had a weight that didn't lift cleanly in a single reading. Outside, through the metal walls of the building, she could hear Falconer on his radio, and the wind in the pines, and somewhere further off, the sound of a second vehicle coming up the logging road. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood up. And then Sandra sent a second message. Not a text, just an image, no caption, forwarded from a number Megan didn't recognize. She opened it. It was a photograph. A hospital room, recognizable by the bed configuration and the monitoring equipment visible at the edge of the frame. A young man sitting upright in the bed. Aaron Greer, specialist, 23 years old, the breathing tube removed and his color back and his right hand raised in what was unmistakably a salute directed at the camera. Below the image, in the message thread, someone had typed, "He asked for her name. We told him. He said to tell her, 'Thank you for not waiting.'" Megan looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she put her phone away and walked toward the door, and Ranger walked beside her, and they came out into the cold Montana afternoon together, the flat gray light pressing down through the pines, and she stood in it with her hands at her sides and her breathing even. She heard Whitaker behind her, on the phone now, using the language of formal processes being set in motion. Names, case numbers, jurisdictional references, the machinery of accountability beginning its slow, grinding turn. And she heard something else. From the second vehicle now parked at the edge of the clearing, 2 figures getting out, Briggs and another handler, and behind them moving with the unsteady coordination of a man still metabolizing whatever they had given him at the transport area. Sergeant First Class Derek Marsh, who was not one of the convoy injured, but who had driven out from the staging area when Briggs called, because he had been with Ghost One's support unit on the 3rd deployment, and he had heard what was happening, and he had come. He looked at Megan across the clearing. She looked at him. He nodded once, The specific economical acknowledgement of people who had been through something together that most people hadn't been through, who recognized each other across whatever time and distance had intervened. She nodded back. And then Whitaker's voice behind her changed register, from the operational to something sharper. And Megan turned, and Whitaker was looking at her phone with an expression that pulled every other thing out of the moment. "What?" Megan said. Whitaker turned the phone screen toward her. It was an email. From the contractor audit office. Time-stamped 40 minutes ago, during the time they had been inside the building. The subject line read, Cole, Ethan, medical records request, urgent flag. And in the body of the email, 3 sentences that changed the shape of everything she had been trying to prove for 4 years. The medical records from the sector engagement had been found. Not the version in the contractor's system, a second copy, filed by the military liaison physician who had been present as an observer and had apparently kept his own contemporaneous documentation in a manner separate from the contractor's records. The kind of documentation that showed, in clinical detail, exactly what each patient's status had been at each decision point, including Ethan Cole, including the timestamp of Vance's reclassification, including the window, the 94-minute window, during which a grade 2 hemorrhagic patient had been reclassified as low priority and had not received intervention, and during which, according to the observer's notes, the sector's surgical resources had been directed toward 2 patients whose clinical status, by the observer's assessment, did not warrant emergency priority over Cole's. Megan read it standing in the clearing with the cold coming off the pines and Ranger pressing warm against her left leg. The records existed. The records had always existed. Someone had known that. She looked at Whitaker. Who filed the records request that generated this response? Whitaker's expression was careful. It came from a military legal office in D.C. filed 3 days ago, which means someone made that request before I drove out here, before Ranger found you in the corridor. She paused. Someone set this in motion before either of us did. Who? Whitaker looked at the email again, at the CC line at the bottom of the chain, which Megan had not read because she had stopped at the body text. She read it now. The CC line contained one name, a name she did not recognize, a rank she did recognize, and below the name, a unit designation that made the cold outside feel suddenly irrelevant. The unit designation was Ghost 1. The name on the CC line was Captain Joel Tanner. Megan had not thought about Joel Tanner in approximately 2 years, which was not the same as forgetting him. He had been the youngest member of Ghost 1's support network on the 3rd deployment, a logistics officer, technically, which was the kind of title that covered a range of actual functions depending on the week and the operational context. He was 26 during that deployment and had a dry sense of humor and a habit of keeping records that nobody had asked him to keep because he had decided early in his career that unofficial documentation was the only kind you could trust. She had not known he was still in. She had not known he had been watching. He filed the records request, she said. Not a question. 3 days ago, Whitaker confirmed. Before any of this, before the convoy arrived, before Ranger found you. She looked at the email with the expression of someone recalibrating a timeline. He's been building toward this independently, probably for longer than 3 days. Why didn't he come to me? I don't know. I'm going to find out. Whitaker was already scrolling to a contact, already moving toward her vehicle for the call, because Whitaker operated in the mode of someone for whom information had a shelf life, and the clock was always running. She stopped and turned back once. For what it's worth, the records they found are detailed. Observer-level documentation with timestamps and clinical notations. Not summaries. Not reports written after the fact. Real-time entries. Megan absorbed that. That's enough, she said. That's more than enough. Whitaker held her gaze for one beat. Go home. Let me handle the next 2 hours of calls. You've done the hard part. Megan looked at the building behind them, at the deputies finishing their documentation, at Vance in the back of Falconer's vehicle, with his hands restrained and his career finished in every way that mattered. She looked at Ranger, who was sitting at her feet watching the clearing with the patient alertness of an animal whose job was done and who was content to wait for the next thing without drama. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. There was no satisfaction, exactly. What she felt was closer to the aftermath of a long physical effort, The particular flat exhaustion of a body and mind that had been operating at high output for an extended period and were now receiving the signal that the acute phase was over. She felt tired. She went home. The next 72 hours moved the way the aftermath of large events always moved, in bureaucratic waves, each one carrying paperwork and questions and institutional processes that required her presence or her signature or her testimony before moving to the next stage. She answered every question. She signed everything that needed signing. She gave a formal statement to Deputy Falconer on the first evening, a secondary statement to the county sheriff's office on the second morning, and a preliminary written account to the state licensing board investigator who arrived from Billings on the third day and spent 4 hours going through her documentation with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the case she was building needed to withstand the kind of legal scrutiny that high-profile misconduct cases attracted. She was not alone for most of it. Sandra appeared with food she hadn't asked for on the second evening and sat in the kitchen while Megan ate and talked about nothing consequential, the hospital gossip, a resident who had accidentally ordered 17 cases of the wrong IV fluid, the broken wheel on the outpatient office chair that had finally been reported to maintenance. It was exactly the kind of conversation that didn't require anything from Megan except presence, and Sandra knew that, which was why she had the kind of friendship that didn't announce itself but turned up when it was needed. Kyle Davis sent a text that read, 7 complaints filed plus 2 residents, just so you know. Nobody was asked to. She read it twice and sent back a single period, which Kyle had apparently learned to interpret correctly because he didn't follow up. Whitaker called on the second night with updates delivered in her efficient, sequential manner. The contractor audit flag had been formally reopened by the Military Oversight Division. Captain Tanner's records request had triggered a procedural review that was now running parallel to the civilian investigation. The observer documentation from the third deployment, filed by a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been attached to the sector as part of a medical standards evaluation and had kept his records in a personal archive separate from the contractor system, was being authenticated, which was a process with a specific timeline, and Whitaker quoted the timeline without editorializing about it. Webb is cooperating, Whitaker said. He's been retired for 3 years. He said, and I am quoting directly here, that he had always assumed the records would surface eventually, and he had kept them specifically for that reason. He kept them for 12 years, Megan said. He kept them for 12 years, Whitaker confirmed. People do things like that. It's not as rare as you'd think. Megan thought about the chaplain's records archive, the report she had filed through a side channel because the direct channels had been compromised, trusting that somewhere in the institutional structure there was a record that would outlast the people trying to suppress it. What about Tanner? She asked. He's coming to Red Creek. He requested a leave extension. I approved it. A pause. He wants to see you. He said to tell you, his words, that he owes you a conversation, and he's been putting it off for 3 years. He doesn't owe me anything. I told him you'd say that. He said to tell you it wasn't about owing. She let that sit. The hospital board convened its full formal session on the 4th day after the incident at the logging road facility. It was not a public meeting, board sessions rarely were, but the outcome of it moved through Northgate Memorial within an hour of adjournment, the way outcomes of significant institutional decisions always move through hospitals, via the nursing staff, who knew everything before the official communications went out. Sandra was the one who called Megan. Full termination, she said without preamble. Effective immediately, the board voted unanimously. All 9 members, including the 2 who voted against escalation in the emergency session, apparently the criminal charges changed their position. Vance had been arraigned the previous morning. The charges were specific and numerous: assault with a firearm, unlawful detention, theft of military property, obstruction of justice, and filed through a separate federal channel that moved faster than the local process. Criminal negligence resulting in death, connected to the Ethan Cole case and the documentation now in federal hands. His attorney had entered a not guilty plea that nobody in the room had taken at face value, including, Megan suspected, the attorney. Laura Mercer, Megan asked. A beat. Laura submitted her resignation before the board met. She cited personal reasons. Sandra's voice was carefully neutral in the way it got when she was reporting something she had opinions about but had decided not to share. The board accepted it. Megan thought about Laura, the organized bureaucratic certainty of her, the tablet and the small envelope, and the badge taken with the efficiency of someone who believed the institution was always worth protecting. She didn't think Laura was a malicious person. She thought Laura was a person who had decided, at some point in her career, that the system was right by default, and that her job was to maintain it rather than question it. That kind of person did real damage without ever understanding that they had. The suspension review, Megan said. Voided, clean record. The board's legal counsel sent the formal documentation this morning. Another pause, longer this time. And there's something else. Tell me. The board is convening again next week for a leadership restructuring session. Vance's position is obviously vacant. The interim chief is Elliot Marsh, which, he's solid, Megan. Everyone respects him. That's a good call. But they're also creating a new position. Director of Emergency Medical Services. Expanded scope, covering department oversight and regional emergency response coordination. Sandra stopped. They asked me if I thought you'd be interested. Megan was quiet for a moment. They asked you. They didn't have your number. I mean, they have your HR file, but they asked me first because they apparently didn't know how you'd respond to a direct approach. What did you tell them? I told them I had no idea, which is true, and that they should call you directly, which they will. A pause. What do I actually tell them? Megan looked out the kitchen window. The ridge was visible in the morning light, the pine stands running up it in uneven lines. The sky above them, the particular clean blue of Montana, when the cloud cover broke and the light came through without filtering. Tell them I'll meet with them, she said. She heard Sandra exhale. Okay. Not a yes, a meeting. I know the difference. But Sandra sounded like someone trying not to sound relieved and not entirely succeeding. I'll tell them. Captain Joel Tanner arrived on the 5th day in a rental vehicle that was slightly too small for him. He was 6'2", broader than she remembered, with a beard that the military had apparently decided to tolerate. He knocked on her door at 9 in the morning, and when she opened it, he looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing what they were going to say and had decided, on arrival, that none of it was right. You look tired, he said. You look older, she said. Yeah. He looked at Ranger, who was sitting behind her left knee, assessing him with professional thoroughness. Hey, boy. Ranger's tail moved once. She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands around the mug, and the manner of someone who had come to say something and was taking his time getting to it, which was a change from the Joel Tanner she remembered, who had been constitutionally impatient. The records, she said when the silence had gone on long enough. You knew about Webb's documentation. I knew he had kept records. I didn't know the specific content until 3 days ago when the request came back. He turned the mug in his hands. I found out about Webb 2 years ago from a mutual contact who was transitioning out. He mentioned that Webb had kept his evaluation files from that sector. I sat on it. Why? Because I didn't know what you wanted, he said. You were out. You'd built something here. I didn't know if you wanted it opened again. He looked at her directly. And because I was scared that if I pushed it and nothing happened again, it would cost you more than the first time did. Megan looked at him. That wasn't your decision to make, she said, and she said it without sharpness, just the plain statement of a fact. I know that now. He said it without argument. I knew it then too, honestly, but I made it anyway, and I'm not going to dress that up as something else. He put the mug down. When Whitaker's office sent me a flag that she was driving to Red Creek, I made the request the same day. I should have done it 2 years ago. Yes, she said. You should have. A beat. I'm sorry, he said. It was direct and undecorated, which was the only kind of apology she had used for. She nodded once. The records are solid? She asked. Webb is thorough. Timestamps, clinical notations, his own assessment of each patient's status at each decision point, cross-referenced with the resource allocation log he kept separately from the contractor system. Tanner's voice shifted into the precise register of someone reporting factual information. The gap between his assessment of Cole and Vance's reclassification is 19 minutes. During those 19 minutes, the sector's surgical resources were directed to 2 patients whose status, by Webb's notation, was less acute. One of those patients was a contractor employee rather than a service member. Megan was still. It's in the documentation, Tanner said. Webb noted it at the time. He flagged it internally as a potential prioritization irregularity. His flag went to the contractor's internal review structure and was closed without action. Vance had relationships inside the contractor's review process. Probably. The federal investigation will dig that out. He paused. Cole's family has been notified. They were told an investigation was being reopened. I don't know what they were told about specifics. She thought about Ethan Cole's family, people she had never met, who had received a notification about their son's death that contained whatever explanation the system had produced, and who had lived with that explanation for years without knowing what she knew. They deserve to know the full picture, she said. They'll get it. The federal process is slower than we want it to be, but it's moving now. It won't stop. He said that last part with the certainty of someone who had done enough to start a mechanism and understood that certain mechanisms, once started, were not easy to interrupt. Vance's attorney is already making noise about a plea arrangement. That usually means the evidence is overwhelming enough that the defense has done the math. Good, she said. Simple, flat, not theatrical. The board meeting was on a Thursday. Megan drove herself. She parked in the visitor lot rather than the staff lot, which she recognized as a habit she needed to break if the meeting went the way it was likely to go, and she walked through the main entrance of Northgate Memorial for the first time since her badge had been taken. The staff she passed in the main corridor, the ones who knew her, which was most of them by this point, responded with the particular collective behavior of people who had been part of something and were still calibrating how to carry that. Some nodded. Kyle Davis, who was at the nurse's station, lifted his chin once and went back to his documentation without making it into a moment, which was exactly right. An older nurse named Patricia Eng, who had worked the floor for 19 years and had been one of the 7 who filed formal complaints, stopped what she was doing and said, "About time," as Megan passed. Megan said, "Thank you, Patricia." Patricia waved it off and went back to what she was doing. The boardroom was on the 4th floor. The 9 board members were present, plus the interim chief, Elliot Marsh, plus the hospital's external legal counsel, plus a liaison from the state licensing board who had driven from Billings again and who had the look of someone who had attended a significant number of these meetings and intended to attend the remainder of this one with professional impartiality. Megan sat where she was directed and listened to the formal portion, the reading of Vance's termination resolution, the summary of the misconduct findings, the outline of the new administrative structure. She answered questions when they were addressed to her. She did not perform humility, and she did not perform triumph. She gave accurate information and honest assessments, and she watched the board members' faces with the attention of someone who was determining, in real time, which of them understood what had happened and which of them were still managing institutional optics. The formal offer of the Director of Emergency Medical Services position came at the end of the session, presented by the board chair, a woman named Eleanor Kidd, who had the look of someone who had been in administrative medicine long enough to recognize the difference between someone who wanted power and someone who wanted things to function correctly. "The scope is broader than the previous department chief role," Kidd said. "We're also adding a regional emergency coordination function, rural hospital network, mass casualty response protocol development, interagency liaison work." She paused. "Major Whitaker's office has expressed interest in a formal collaboration arrangement." "I know," Megan said. "I've spoken with her." "Is that a consideration?" "It's a compatible arrangement. The liaison program she's building and the regional coordination function you're describing address overlapping needs. It makes sense to run them in parallel." Kidd looked at her for a moment. "You've already thought through the structure." "I've had 5 days," Megan said. A beat, and then something moved across Kidd's face that might have been the beginning of a smile before she brought it back to professional neutral. "The position is yours if you want it," she said. Megan thought about the outpatient office with the broken chair and the parking lot window. She thought about 3 years of careful smallness, of performing invisibility until it started to feel like identity. She thought about the armband on her kitchen table and a dog who had crossed a hospital corridor to find her and a 23-year-old soldier who had sent a photograph with a salute. "I'll take it," she said, "on the condition that my first decisions regarding staff structure and protocol reform aren't subject to board review for the first 90 days. Kidd glanced at legal counsel, a brief, quiet exchange. Then she looked back at Megan. 60 days. 75. Another beat. Done. What? She was in the corridor outside the boardroom, waiting for the elevator, when Elliot Marsh caught up to her. He was a straightforward man who had always treated nursing staff like colleagues and had been doing quiet, competent work in emergency medicine for 17 years without accumulating the kind of institutional gravity that Vance had wielded. He looked currently like a man who was relieved about something he wasn't entirely sure was over. I want you to know, he said, that I'll support whatever structure you're building. No politics from my end. I know that, Elliot. She did. I'm going to need someone to run the clinical side of the department while I'm handling the administrative and coordination functions. Someone who knows the staff and won't be precious about the hierarchy. I can do that. I know you can. She looked at him directly. I'll make the formal ask next week once I've had time to map the structure, but I wanted you to know now that it's coming. He nodded with the straightforward relief of someone who had been wondering where they stood and now knew. The elevator arrived. One other thing, Megan said as she stepped in. The residents who filed complaints, make sure they're not having second thoughts about their positions here. If anyone is creating pressure, informally, sideways, the kind of thing that doesn't show up in documentation, I need to know. I'll watch for it. It won't be obvious, she said. Never is. The doors closed. The federal investigation moved with the grinding, implacable pace of federal investigations, which was simultaneously frustrating and, Megan had to acknowledge, probably appropriate given the complexity of what it was documenting. Dr. Webb's observer records were authenticated within 2 weeks. The contractor audit flag was formally reopened and expanded to include the original internal review that had closed without action. Vance's attorney, who had, as Tanner predicted, initiated plea discussions, was now negotiating the specific terms of a guilty plea to charges that had expanded 3 times since the initial arraignment. Megan was told by the federal investigator assigned to the Cole case that Ethan Cole's family had requested a meeting with her. She said yes without hesitation. The meeting happened at a location of the family's choosing, a conference room at a community center in Billings, neutral ground. Cole's mother and his older brother drove from 2 different cities to be there. His mother was a quiet woman in her 60s with the composed expression of someone who had spent years holding grief in a particular controlled configuration and was now being asked to reopen the container. Megan told them everything she knew in the order that she knew it, without softening the parts that were hard. She told them what she had assessed in the sector. She told them what she had filed and when. She told them that the report had disappeared into a process that had not worked the way it was supposed to work, and that she had not stopped looking for a way forward. Cole's brother, Marcus, 34, who had come in with a set jaw and the body language of someone expecting to be managed, sat across from her and listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the directness of someone who needed the question answered. "I filed twice while I was still in service," she said. "After I separated, I didn't have institutional standing to force a process that didn't want to move. I had evidence, but not leverage." She held his gaze. "And I'm going to be honest with you. I was also afraid that filing again would produce the same result and cost me more than I had left to spend." He looked at her. "That's more honest than I expected," he said finally. "You came a long way," she said. "You deserved the actual answer." Cole's mother reached across the table and covered Megan's hand with hers, briefly, and then withdrew it without saying anything. Megan didn't fill the silence with words. They stayed for another hour. She answered every question they had, including the ones she didn't have complete answers to. When they left, Marcus Cole paused at the door and turned back. "He used to talk about the medics," Marcus said, "from that deployment. He said the medics were the ones you trusted when everything else broke down." A pause. "He would have wanted you to know that." Megan drove back to Red Creek alone. 4 hours on roads that moved from highway to state route to county route to the 2-lane strip that ran through Red Creek proper. And she did not listen to anything because the silence was what the drive needed. She was back at the hospital by 7 in the morning. Her hospital, now in a way that felt different from any professional possession she had ever experienced. She was walking the emergency department with a legal pad and a critical eye toward the triage flow pattern that she intended to restructure within the first 2 weeks, and she was in the middle of a note about the placement of the crash cart in Bay 3 when her phone rang. Whitaker. "The plea," Whitaker said. "He's taking it." Megan stopped walking. "All counts?" "All counts. The negotiation landed on a reduced charge on the coal negligence count in exchange for a full guilty plea to everything else and complete cooperation with the contractor review process. Whitaker's voice was flat and factual, the way she delivered things that required careful processing before reaction. Sentencing guidelines put him between 14 and 18 years. His medical license will be permanently revoked as a condition of the plea. The revocation goes into effect on the day the plea is entered. 14 to 18 years. A medical license, gone. The contractor review process opened, which meant other cases, other decisions, other documentation that had been filed and not acted on, and would now see actual daylight. And Cole's family? Megan asked. The Federal Victim Advocacy Office has been in contact with them since this morning. They'll be present at sentencing if they choose. Megan looked at the emergency department around her, the bay she had been assessing, the nurses starting the morning shift, the particular organized motion of a department that was already 2 weeks into her tenure moving differently than it had. Not perfectly, not without friction, but differently. Whitaker, she said. The Ghost 1 designation on that CC line in the email. Tanner's unit affiliation. Ghost 1 was formally deactivated after the third deployment rotation, Whitaker said. Tanner's unit designation on the email is a legacy administrative notation. The investigators asked about it. What did you tell them? I told them it was a call sign that belonged to a group of people who had kept doing their jobs after the official record said the job was finished. A pause. Which is accurate. It is, Megan said. There's one more thing, Whitaker said, and the slight shift in her tone, away from informational and toward something more deliberate, made Megan pay a different kind of attention. Something that has been sitting in a military personnel file for 4 years pending a processing decision. Megan was still. The commendation, she said. The Army Commendation Medal with Valor, cited for actions on the third deployment. The citation that was submitted through your unit command and entered a pending status that it never left. Whitaker's voice was precise, each word placed with care. The investigation into Vance's contractor records flagged an administrative anomaly in the citation processing queue, a hold that had been placed on several personnel actions connected to the Ghost 1 support unit around the time of the contractor review. The hold was placed by an administrative account connected to the contractor's liaison office. Megan understood what that meant before Whitaker said it. He held it, she said. The contractor's liaison office held it, Whitaker said carefully. Whether that was Vance directly or someone acting on his behalf, that's part of what the investigation is now examining. A pause. The hold has been removed. The citation is being processed through the correct channel, which means, don't, Megan said. A beat. Don't tell me yet, she said. Tell me when it's done. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Understood. They ended the call. Megan stood in Bay 3 with her legal pad and looked at the crash cart placement that she needed to change, and the triage flow pattern she was going to restructure, and the morning shift that was starting around her with the sounds that emergency departments made at shift change, voices, the percussion of equipment, the particular frequencies of a place that was always in the process of receiving whatever the world sent through its doors. She made a note about the crash cart. She moved to Bay 2. And her phone buzzed one more time. A notification, not a call. A message from a number she had added to her contacts 2 weeks ago and had not expected to hear from so quickly. It was from Marcus Cole. It was 4 words. We got the records. She read it. Then, the real ones. All of it. And then, after a pause that she could imagine him sitting through on the other end, Mom wants to know your address. She made something. She said you'd understand what it means. Megan looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked up, through the bay window, toward the main corridor where the morning was beginning in earnest. Staff moving, the radio at the desk catching a dispatch call. Somewhere in the building, a door opening onto the kind of ordinary emergency that required exactly the kind of person she had spent 3 years pretending not to be. She typed a reply to Marcus Cole. She gave him her address. And at that exact moment, Sandra appeared at the bay entrance with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had heard something through the hospital's invisible information network and was deciding how to present it. The residents' meeting, Sandra said. The ones who filed complaints. They're asking if you're coming. When is it? 20 minutes. I'll be there. Megan took one of the coffees. And Sandra, I need you in a formal meeting this afternoon. I'm creating a nursing supervisory role with expanded authority over patient safety reporting. I need someone who knows this department and doesn't get intimidated by administrators. Sandra looked at her. Are you asking me or telling me? She said. Asking. Then yes. Sandra took a sip of her own coffee. Obviously, yes. She started to walk away, then stopped. There's something else. It came in this morning to the main desk, addressed to you personally. She reached into her pocket and produced a small envelope, the kind used for personal correspondence rather than official communication. The return address is a law office in Billings, but there's a handwritten note on the back. Megan turned it over. The handwriting was not from any lawyer. It was precise and economical, the writing of someone who communicated without waste. It said, "There are 6 of us. We've been waiting for the right moment. Webb, Dr. Marcus Webb, the observer physician, the man who had kept 12 years of records in a personal archive and had filed them with the patience of someone who understood that certain things required the right conditions before they could move." Megan looked at the envelope. 6. Webb had written 6, which was the number of soldiers she had kept alive in that sector for 11 hours, with compromised equipment and failing support, while she waited for extraction that was 40 minutes late. All 6 of them had found a lawyer, and they had been waiting. She opened the envelope in her office. Not the outpatient room with the broken chair. That office no longer existed as her space, because the broken chair had been replaced. The window still looked out on the parking lot, and the room had been reassigned to a per diem coordinator who needed it. Her office now was larger, on the 2nd floor, with a window that faced the ridge. She had not decorated it yet. There was a desk, a computer, a whiteboard she had already covered in restructuring notes, and a chair that fit correctly. She read the letter standing up. Webb's attorney had drafted it in the formal language of legal correspondence, but the substance was Webb's. She could hear him in the structure of it, the way each sentence carried exactly the weight it needed to carry, and nothing more. The 6 soldiers she had treated during the extraction delay had connected through a veterans advocacy network 18 months earlier, and Webb had found them through the same channel that had led him to Tanner. Together, the 6 of them, with Webb's observer documentation and their own contemporaneous accounts, had engaged a firm that specialized in military medical malpractice and contractor accountability. They had been waiting, the letter said, for the federal investigation to reach a sufficient stage before filing their own civil action. Webb had calculated, correctly as it turned out, that a premature filing would give Vance's legal team room to challenge the documentation's authenticity before the federal process had validated it, so they had waited, and now the federal investigation had authenticated Webb's records. The plea negotiation had confirmed Vance's admission to the core conduct, and the 6 soldiers and 1 retired observer physician were prepared to move. The civil action named Vance personally and the contractor company institutionally. At the bottom of the letter, below the attorney's signature block, Webb had added 3 lines in his own handwriting. You filed the first report. Everything that came after only worked because you didn't stop caring about what happened to that boy. I kept the records because I knew eventually someone like you would still be in the right position to use them. I'm glad I was right. Megan read it twice, put it on the desk, looked at the ridge through the window. Then she went to the residents' meeting, because it was starting in 4 minutes, and she had said she would be there. The meeting was in the 2nd floor conference room. 9 residents and 2 fellows, most of them younger than she had been during her first deployment, all of them carrying the particular guarded energy of people who had done something professionally risky and were still calibrating whether the outcome would justify it. 2 of them had filed formal complaints. The others had provided supporting statements. None of them had been asked to do either by anyone above their training level, which meant they had decided for themselves, which was the thing that mattered most. She did not give a speech. She did not perform gratitude in the way institutional moments often required. She sat at the table and talked to them for 40 minutes about the specific and practical, what the investigation's outcome meant for their documentation going forward, how the new patient safety reporting structure would function, what their rights were if they encountered pressure from any attending or senior staff regarding clinical decisions. She told them the new structure had teeth, that complaints filed through the proper channel would be reviewed by an external body rather than an internal one, that retaliation was now a terminable offense with a clear paper trail, and that she intended to make the paper trail robust enough to survive whatever institutional pressures tried to erode it over the next several years. A fellow named Arias, mid-20s, sharp, the one who had told Sandra about Vance pressuring him to sign off on a decision he disagreed with, raised his hand near the end. "What do we do if it happens again?" he asked. "Different person, different version of the same thing." "Document immediately," Megan said. "Date, time, specific language, witnesses if present. File within 24 hours. Don't wait to see if it resolves itself, because it won't resolve itself. It'll just become harder to prove." She looked at him directly. "And come to me." "What if you're not here?" "Then Sandra, then Elliot. The structure is designed so that the reporting path doesn't run through the person creating the problem." She paused. "But also, trust your own assessment. You assessed that patient correctly. You knew Vance's decision was wrong. You were right. That instinct is worth something. Don't let someone else talk you out of it." Arias nodded slowly. The meeting ended and they filed out, and Megan stayed for a moment in the empty room and sat with the quiet. There was still work on the whiteboard in her office. There were still protocols that needed rewriting and staffing schedules that needed restructuring and a regional coordination framework she had promised Whitaker a draft of by the end of the month. The list was not short, and she was not the kind of person who found comfort in a short list. A full list meant there was still something to build, and building was the thing she knew how to do. She went back to work. Vance entered his plea 6 weeks after the incident at the logging road facility. Megan was not in the courtroom. She had been given the option of attending and had declined, because there was nothing she needed to witness in person to confirm what she already knew, and because the emergency department was running a new intake protocol that morning that she wanted to observe directly rather than receive secondhand. She stood at the intake desk with her notepad and watched the first 2 hours of the new flow, took her notes, identified 3 friction points she needed to address, and was writing them up when Sandra appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "It's done." "I know," Megan said, because Whitaker had texted her at the moment the plea was entered. 16 years, Sandra said. They came in at the high end of the range. 16 years. His medical license permanently revoked. The contractor company facing a civil action from 6 soldiers and an observer physician with 12 years of carefully preserved documentation. The internal review at the contractor that had closed the original audit flag without action, that process was now itself under investigation, which meant other cases, other names, other decisions that had been buried with similar efficiency. The machine that had protected Richard Vance for 12 years had been dismantled piece by piece, and each piece that came off revealed another piece underneath that needed to come off too. And that was how it went when an institution decided that accountability was worth the cost of the infrastructure it dismantled. The nursing staff wanted to do something, Sandra said. Not a party. They specifically said not a party, but something. "Tell them to put the energy into the memorial board," Megan said. "We're putting Ethan Cole's name on it. I've already spoken with his family. They said yes." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's good," she said. "That's the right thing." "It's not enough," Megan said, but it's the right thing." Those were not the same thing. She had learned that early, and she had not unlearned it. The right thing and the sufficient thing existed in different categories, and confusing them was the beginning of a kind of moral laziness that she didn't have tolerance for in herself or in the people around her. Ethan Cole's name on a board in a hospital lobby was acknowledgement, which mattered. It was not restoration, because restoration was not available. That gap was real, and she carried it, and she thought it was correct to carry it, because the day she stopped feeling the weight of what hadn't been possible was the day she stopped being useful to the people who needed her to understand what was at stake. The military ceremony was in February, 4 months after the plea, at a facility outside Billings that served as a regional coordination point for several units. The weather was what February in Montana was, brutal and indifferent and brilliant in the particular way of clear, cold days where the light came off the snow at an angle that made everything look sharper than it was. Whitaker had called 2 weeks prior. "The citation is fully processed," she said. "Army Commendation Medal with Valor. The ceremony will include the formal restoration of the citation record, which means it goes into your permanent file correctly dated to the original action, not to now, but to when it happened." A pause. "The unit that was designated Ghost 1 has been officially recognized in the citation, which means it exists in the record now, formally. Megan had said she would be there. She drove herself and parked badly and walked into the facility with Ranger beside her. Briggs had, after a process involving more paperwork than anyone had anticipated, arranged for Ranger to be formally assigned to her as a civilian liaison working dog, which was a designation that had required Whitaker to make 3 separate calls, but which was now official. He walked at her left knee with the precise, relaxed attention of a dog that was exactly where he was supposed to be. The room was not large. Military ceremonies didn't require large rooms. They required the right people in them. There were officers she recognized by rank and some by name. There were 6 other people she recognized by something else. The particular way they carried themselves. The specific posture of people who had been through something and come out of it changed in ways that didn't fully show from the outside, but were visible to anyone who had been through something similar. The 6 soldiers she had kept alive. They were in a line along the wall, not in formation, just standing the way people stood when they were trying to be professional and were also feeling something that made that difficult. They were older than she had last seen them. Obviously, 4 years was 4 years. And they ranged from still active duty to recently separated to one who had clearly been out for a while and had built a life in the civilian world that sat comfortably on him. They looked at her when she came in, and she looked at them, and nobody moved for a moment in the way that people didn't move when a room registered something that didn't have language for it. The one who moved first was a man named Darius Webb, no relation to the physician, just a coincidence of surname, who had been the most critical of the 6, the one she had worked on longest during the 11 hours, the one whose odds she had privately calculated and privately refused to accept. He was 31 now, and wearing a staff sergeant's insignia, and he walked across the room and extended his hand. "Sergeant Callahan," he said, using her former rank, which nobody had used in 4 years. She shook his hand. "Webb, you're running a hospital now. Working on it. I heard you're also training rural paramedics to handle mass casualty scenarios. Whitaker's program. I'm contributing." "We heard," he said, and there was something in his voice, not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was smaller than what he was communicating, but something in that register, something that acknowledged a continuity between what she had done in that sector and what she was doing now, the same instinct directed at different scales. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "How's the arm?" He had taken a fragment hit to the left arm during the engagement. She had cleaned and packed it with what she had, which wasn't enough but had been sufficient. He held up the arm, rolled back the sleeve slightly to show a scar that was old and settled and had become part of him the way old scars did. "Good," he said. "It's good." The ceremony itself was brief and precise, which was the correct approach. The people in the room understood what it meant without needing it elaborated, and elaborating it would have made it smaller rather than larger. Major Whitaker presented the citation. She read the relevant language, the date of the action, the location identified only by sector designation, the specifics of what had been done and in what conditions. Megan stood and received the medal and the formal restoration of the citation record, and she did not cry during it, because she had known this was coming for long enough that the sharp edge of it had been worn down by anticipation, and what she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, the specific sense of a record being corrected, of a thing that had been made wrong being made, if not right exactly, then at least accurate. She thought about Joel Tanner, who had not been able to come because his unit had deployed 3 days prior, but who had sent a message the night before that said, "I know it doesn't cover what the delay cost, but I'm glad it's happening." She had replied, "Me too," and that had been sufficient for both of them. She thought about Webb, Dr. Marcus Webb, retired, who had kept 12 years of records in a personal archive because he had decided early that unofficial documentation was the only kind you could fully trust. She had spoken with him by phone the week before, and he had been exactly as she had imagined from his writing, precise, economical, without sentimentality about what he had done, but not without feeling about why. "I should have pushed harder at the time," he had said. "You documented it," she had said. "That mattered. It took 12 years to matter." "Yes," she had said. "It did." And she hadn't made it easier than that because it wasn't easier than that. And he was a man who could handle the weight of accurate assessment. After the ceremony, there was coffee and a table of food that nobody ate much of because that wasn't the purpose of being in the room. She talked to each of the 6, briefly with some, longer with others. One of them, a woman named Torrance, who had separated 2 years prior and was now working as an EMT in Wyoming, had driven 8 hours to be there and showed it in the specific exhaustion of someone who had made that calculation and considered it obviously correct. "I have a question," Torrance said. She was direct in the way that people who worked emergency services were direct. No runway before the point. "When you were working on us, during those 11 hours, were you scared?" Megan thought about it honestly rather than performing an answer. "Not during," she said. "There was too much to do. The fear came after, when extraction arrived and I had time to register what the preceding 11 hours had actually been." She paused. "I was scared of having done something wrong, of having made a decision in those 11 hours that cost someone something I couldn't give back. I went through it all again afterward, every decision, looking for the place where I'd gotten it wrong. Did you find one?" "I found decisions I'd make differently with more resources. I didn't find ones that were wrong given what I had." She said it without pride, just as an assessment. That's not the same thing as it being okay. It was still 11 hours in conditions that weren't okay. The not okayness doesn't disappear because the decision's held. Torrance looked at her. "Do you still go through it?" "Less than I used to," Megan said. "It's in a different place now. Not gone. Different." Torrance nodded slowly, with the nod of someone who had their own version of the same thing in a different location. She drove back to Red Creek in the late afternoon, the light going amber over the ridge, and the temperature dropping in the way it did when the sun got low in Montana winter, the cold coming from the ground up rather than the sky down. Ranger sat in the passenger seat and did not look out the window but faced forward, which was his highway posture, attentive without alertness, present without active work. She had been thinking, on the drive out and now on the drive back, about what Torrance had asked her, about fear, about the 11 hours and the decisions inside them, and the years of carrying those decisions in a specific private location that most people in her civilian life had never known existed. She had built a life around that concealment, not because she was ashamed of her military service, she had never been ashamed of it, but because she had, somewhere in the 18 months between her third deployment and her separation, arrived at the conclusion that the institution she had served had made her invisible by choice, had buried her citation and dismissed her report and produced a silence where accountability should have been, and that returning to civilian life meant deciding what to do with that. She had decided to become invisible herself. She had thought she was being strategic. She had thought smallness was protection. She had been wrong, in the specific way that people were wrong when they confused the absence of conflict with safety. She had not been safe. She had been suspended and isolated and managed by a man who had recognized her and understood that her silence protected him as much as it protected her. She had spent 3 years performing irrelevance, and the cost of it had been paid by the people around her who needed someone in that building who was not afraid to do the right thing and who had watched her make herself small instead. That was the part she sat with most. Not Vance. Vance was a man who had made choices and was now bearing the consequences of them, and the machinery of accountability was grinding through its process and producing the outcomes that process was designed to produce. The part she sat with was her own 3 years of smallness, the specific choices she had made during them, the things those choices had cost other people. Kyle Davis, who had watched her absorb Vance's behavior for a year before anyone said anything, because she modeled silence. The residents who had been pressured and had looked at the senior nursing staff and seen people who kept their heads down and had done the same. The patients who had moved through an emergency department led by a man whose judgment was corrupted and whose authority was unchallenged in part because the most capable person in the building had made herself invisible. She did not catastrophize this. She did not build it into something larger than it was. But she also did not absolve herself of it, because the honest accounting of a thing was the beginning of not repeating it, and she intended not to repeat it. The outpatient clinic got a new intake coordinator in March. The hire was Sandra's recommendation, a woman named Yolanda Briggs, no relation to the handler, who had 15 years of emergency nursing experience at a hospital in Denver and had relocated to Red Creek for reasons she described as personal, and that Sandra had described to Megan as solid. I checked. Yolanda had opinions about intake protocol and expressed them in the direct, non-political way of someone who had been in the work long enough to know that the point was the work. Megan liked her immediately, which she took as a reasonable signal. Patricia Eng was formally elevated to nursing supervisor in March as well, a title that finally matched the authority and institutional knowledge she had been deploying informally for years. Her first act in the role was to convene a meeting with the 4 nursing assistants who had been working the lowest visibility shifts under Vance's tenure and ask them, directly and without a supervisor present, what would make their shifts function better. The list they produced was specific and actionable, and Patricia brought it to Megan, and Megan brought 3 of the 4 items to the next operational meeting and got them implemented by the end of the week. The 4th item required capital budget approval, which required a board presentation, which Megan prepared and delivered in April. The board approved it. Eleanor Kidd, voting in favor, met Megan's eyes across the table with the expression of someone who was recalibrating an estimate upward. Arias finished his residency in June and accepted a fellowship in emergency medicine at a hospital in Missoula. On his last day at Northgate Memorial, he left a card on Megan's desk. She found it at the end of a long shift and read it standing in her office in the dark, because she hadn't turned the light on yet. It said, "I came to this residency thinking the most important thing was clinical skill. I still think that's important, but I learned here that clinical skill without the willingness to say what you see is just competence performing in a broken system. Thank you for showing me the difference." And then, below that, in smaller writing, "Also the crash cart placement in Bay 3 is much better now." She put the card in the desk drawer. She turned the light on. She went home. Whitaker's Civilian Military Medical Liaison Program launched its first rural training cohort in May. Megan ran 2 of the 7 sessions herself, mass casualty triage and prolonged field care, which were the areas where rural emergency services consistently showed the largest gap between need and capacity. The attendees were paramedics, EMTs, a few rural nurses, 2 volunteer fire department medical officers from communities so remote that their nearest hospital was 45 minutes away on a good road in good weather. They were the people who would be first on scene when everything went wrong in a place that had no backup nearby. And they were sitting in a room paying attention with the intensity of people who understood that attention was the difference between someone living and dying on a road in the middle of nowhere with no one coming for a long time. She taught them the way she had wanted to be taught, not from abstraction, but from specifics. From the decisions inside specific scenarios, the reasoning behind each step, the places where the right answer was uncertain, and you had to make a call anyway and document your reasoning and keep moving. She taught them that fear during the acute phase was information, not failure. She taught them that the pause before acting was sometimes the most important action, and sometimes it was the thing that killed someone, and the skill was learning to tell the difference. One of the paramedics, a man named Odell, in his 40s, who had been working rural emergency services for 18 years and had the resigned competence of someone who had long stopped expecting adequate resourcing, asked her on the second day, during a break, how she had developed the ability to make decisions cleanly under that level of pressure. She thought about it honestly. "I don't think it's clean," she said. "I think you learn to move through the mess faster. The mess is still there. You're just not waiting for it to resolve before you act." Odell looked at her. "That's actually useful." "Most of the useful things are uncomfortable," she said. He laughed, a short, dry sound from someone who hadn't expected to find anything funny in the preceding 2 days of intensive training. She hadn't expected it either, but there it was. The sentencing was in August. She read about it in the morning on her phone before she got out of bed. A legal news alert that Whitaker had set up for her. She hadn't asked. Whitaker had just done it, because Whitaker operated on the principle that relevant information should reach the relevant people without them having to go looking. The sentencing document confirmed 16 years, the revocation of the medical license, mandatory cooperation with the contractor review, and this was the part that took her a moment, a formal statement from the judge at sentencing that addressed the Cole case specifically, naming the nature of the conduct and its consequences in language that was on the public record and would stay there. Ethan Cole's name was on the public record now, not buried in a contractor's internal review file, not in a chaplain's archive, not in a pending citation queue where an administrative hold had stopped it from moving. On the record, in a federal sentencing document that existed and was accessible and would not disappear. She put her phone on the nightstand. She lay there for a moment and looked at the ceiling and thought about the version of herself that had driven through Red Creek twice before accepting the position at Northgate Memorial and had decided that invisibility was survivable. That woman had been right that it was survivable. She had not been right that it was sufficient. She had been trying to protect herself from a second loss of the kind she had already experienced. A report filed and ignored, a citation buried, an institution choosing its own comfort over the correction of its own failures. And in doing so, she had made herself useless to the people who needed her to be present. The thing she understood now, that she hadn't understood then, was that protection by subtraction didn't actually protect anything. It just made the loss quieter. The institution that had buried her citation hadn't done it because she was visible and threatening. It had done it because she had filed a report and then separated, and separated people were easy to ignore. If she had stayed in, if she had pushed, if she had found Webb sooner, or Tanner, or Whitaker's office, or any of the channels that existed for exactly this kind of problem. She didn't complete that thought. There was no productive end to it. She had made the choices she had made with the understanding she had possessed at the time, and the choices had cost what they had cost, and she had done what she could with the subsequent years. And the subsequent years had produced a result that she could not have predicted when she had driven through Red Creek the first time, and decided it looked like the right size of invisible. She got up. She fed Ranger. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the ridge in the early morning light, which was the color of something that didn't have a name, but that she had come to associate with being in the right place at the right time in her life. In October, 1 year, almost exactly, after a Belgian Malinois had crossed a hospital corridor and dropped a scorched armband at her feet, Megan walked through the main entrance of Northgate Memorial at 6:40 in the morning. Ranger walked beside her. She had developed the habit of early arrivals, not because she felt compelled to perform dedication, but because the hospital was different at that hour, quieter, the overnight staff winding down, the day staff not yet at full volume, the building in the in-between state that showed you its actual structure rather than its busy hours performance. She used those early hours to walk and to think and to notice the things that mid-shift noise made it easy to miss. The memorial board was in the main lobby, which had been redesigned in June. It was not a traditional memorial. She had specifically not wanted something that looked institutional, because institutional memorials communicated grief at a distance rather than acknowledgement up close. It was a simple panel, dark wood, with names and brief notations. Medical staff who had died in service to the hospital's patients, patients whose families had donated or contributed in their name. And now, at the bottom of the panel, in the same style as every other name on it, Ethan Cole, with the year and a single line. In memory of a soldier who deserved better care than he received. This hospital commits to doing better. She had written that line herself. The board had suggested softer language twice. She had declined twice. The line stayed. She stopped at the board the way she stopped at it most mornings, not for long, 30 seconds, 40, and then she kept moving. The emergency department was starting to find its shift change rhythm. Sandra was at the charge desk going through the handover notes with the focused attention she brought to every handover, because Sandra had concluded early in her career that the most preventable harms happened in transition, and she intended to prevent them. She looked up when Megan passed. "Odell called," Sandra said. "His county approved the mass casualty supply grant. He wanted you to know." Good. Megan meant it. Odell's county was the remotest of the rural communities in the liaison program's coverage area, and the supply gap there had been the most acute. "Tell him I'll do a site visit in November." "Already scheduled it," Sandra said, and went back to the handover notes. Megan went to her office. The Ghost One armband was in a frame on the wall behind her desk. She had put it there in January, after carrying it in her coat pocket for 3 months, because she had decided that the right place for it was visible rather than hidden. Not as a trophy. She did not think of it as a trophy. As a record. A piece of physical evidence that a thing had existed, that people had done difficult work together in difficult conditions, and had built something worth preserving, even when the institution they served had tried to suppress it. She sat down. She pulled up the morning's operational notes, the staffing situation for the day shift, the outstanding items on her protocol revision list. The list was shorter than it had been 6 months ago, which meant that the work she had done was accumulating into something durable rather than just redistributing the same problems across different surfaces. That was the measure she used. Not whether things were perfect, but whether the errors were new ones rather than the same ones repeating. New errors meant you were moving. She was halfway through the staffing review when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize with a Montana area code. She answered. "This is Specialist Aaron Greer," said the voice on the other end. He was young, she could hear it, and he was making an effort to sound formal that was just slightly off, the effort visible through the performance of it. "I don't know if you remember me." "I remember you," she said. A pause. "I wanted to call. I should have called sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." "You were recovering." "I've been recovered for 8 months." Another pause. "I heard what happened after, with the investigation and everything. Someone in my unit who knew your name, they followed it and they told me." He stopped, started again. "You saved my life and then you lost your badge the same afternoon. That wasn't right." "It worked out," she said. "That's not... I know it worked out. I'm not calling because it didn't work out. I'm calling because I wanted to say that I know what you did, and I know it wasn't free, and someone should tell you directly that it mattered." His voice had dropped some of the formal performance. He sounded closer to 23 now. "My mom wanted to send something. I told her I wanted to call first." Megan looked at the armband on the wall. "Tell your mom thank you," she said. "And tell her the best thing you can both do is exactly what you're doing. Living your life. That's what the work was for." A silence on the line. Then, "Are you always this hard to say thank you to?" She almost smiled. "I'm told yes." He laughed. The surprised, genuine laugh of someone who had prepared for a different kind of conversation and had arrived somewhere less scripted and found it better. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Thank you for picking up. Take care of yourself, Specialist." "Yes, ma'am." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, with the morning light coming through the ridge-facing window and the sound of the hospital starting its day in the corridor outside her door. She thought about what Greer had said. Someone should tell you directly that it mattered. And she thought about all the years she had spent performing smallness, in the specific belief that making yourself visible was the same as making yourself a target. It was. That part had been true. But what she had miscalculated was the cost of the alternative. The target was real, but so was the cost of hiding from it. She had been hiding from one thing and had inadvertently created the conditions for another. And the people who had paid most directly for that miscalculation were not her. They were the residents who had watched her absorb Vance's behavior and modeled their own silence on hers. They were the nurses who had kept their complaints in personal files rather than official channels, because the official channels led to people who led to Vance. They were Ethan Cole, which was the hardest part of the accounting, and the one she returned to most honestly and carried most carefully. She could not fix the past. She could build something in the present that made the same failures harder to repeat. That was not a redemption arc. It was not a clean resolution of everything that had gone wrong. It was the actual, imperfect, ongoing work of someone who had understood something too late and was spending the rest of her professional life making it count anyway. She opened the staffing review. She finished it. She went out into her department. Ranger walked with her. Through the bay corridor, past the intake desk where Kyle Davis was starting his shift, and nodded once without breaking his documentation rhythm, past the crash cart in Bay 3 that was exactly where it needed to be, past the memorial board in the lobby where a soldier's name was on the record where it belonged. She was not the invisible nurse in the faded scrubs. She had not been that person for a year. She was the director of emergency medical services at Northgate Memorial Hospital, a combat medic with 3 deployments and a Silver Star and 11 hours in a sector that she had held together with inadequate equipment and the specific refusal to accept that the people in her care were going to die on her watch. She was a mentor and a bureaucratic fighter, and someone who made enemies of the right people and allies of the ones who did the actual work. She was imperfect at all of it. She got the staffing calculations wrong sometimes and had to rework them. She got impatient with board processes and had to rein herself in. She was better at emergency medicine than at administrative politics, and she was learning the latter slowly, without grace, because it was necessary, and she did not have the luxury of learning only the things she was naturally good at. She was, on most days, doing the best work of her life. Richard Vance was in a federal correctional facility, his license gone, his career ended, the contractor machine that had shielded him now open to scrutiny that was producing findings. He could not have imagined when he had decided 12 years ago to manage a problem by suppressing it rather than correcting it. 6 soldiers were alive who might not have been. A family had answers that were late but were real. A young paramedic in a remote county had a supply grant and a training cohort and a framework for doing his job better in the middle of nowhere, with no one coming for a long time. Megan walked to the window at the end of the emergency department corridor, the one that faced east, where the ridge caught the morning light and turned it into something that made the whole valley look briefly generous. And she stood there for a moment, with her hand on Ranger's head and the sound of the hospital around her, the particular frequency of a place that was always in the process of receiving whatever the world sent through its doors. She had spent 3 years trying to become invisible. She understood now what that had cost. She understood, with equal clarity, that the work she did now, imperfect, contested, ongoing, never finished, was the only adequate answer to that cost she had available. It wasn't everything, it was what she had. She turned around and walked back into the work and did not look back.